Professor Malcolm Horne. Professor Horne is the Deputy Director of the Florey Neuroscience Institute. He's also a consultant neurologist at the St Vincent's Hospital and the Conjoint Professor at the Centre of Neuroscience at the University of Melbourne. Professor Horne's clinical and research interests are in movement disorders, in particular Parkinson's disease. In particular, he's known for the development of the personal kinetograph. Please join me in welcoming Professor Malcolm Horne.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. And the instructions that I had was to tell you about what sort of research I do, talk about the PKG that we developed, and also project the future. And I thought this was going to take far too long, so I will talk very briefly about some of the things I do, then get straight on to a very brief summary of the PKG, and then where I think the future lies for neurodegeneration. So that's really the main part of what I'm going to talk about. So is this area up here. Now, who am I? So this is one of the, by explaining this, I'm going to talk about one of the dilemmas that comes for an academic who's interested in research, is that there are 4 things that I do there, and they are always competing for my time in terms of the activities. I'm a neurologist, and there's always more patients to see. I'm involved in administering or running a company that's commercialising the product of my research. I've been involved in basic science and bench research, and of course there's always demands on administration. So we can think of that being the most important thing that's always been that I wanted to look after, and I have these competing factors of being a clinician and administration. Now the difficulty is the latter two, being a clinician and an administrator, always compete for your time and will take it over unless you put a big fence around your clinical research. So, and I think this is one of the, to be successful in research, that's one of the key messages to learn, is it's a really delicate flower that you must look after. The other thing which I'm just going to briefly talk about is that my research has already been mentioned, is been around factors which control movement, the physiology of movement, particularly that is related to Parkinson's disease, and the role of dopaminergic function and the strategy in producing movement. And out of my laboratory came a process for measuring the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Now, why is that important? Well, if you think of almost any disease where we've made serious inroads, one of the key factors is that we can measure the consequence of our therapy. So think blood pressure, you can measure the blood pressure, and that's why you can titrate the dose. Diabetes, you can measure the blood glucose. Asthma, you can measure peak flow. Now with Parkinson's, we haven't been able to measure it. You've got to come to someone like me. Trust me, I'm a doctor, I can measure it. It's very subjective. And the second is that Parkinson's is a disease like diabetes that fluctuates over the course of the day and from day to day. And they also have the problem that people with Parkinson's lose a degree of executive function and can't objectively assess their symptoms. So it's very hard to titrate treatment unless you've got a way of measuring it. So we have developed a way of measuring that, and it's gone through the stage, which is the next thing, which is it's gone to commercialisation. That means that it's been patented, it's got approval by the TGA, the FDA, the CE mark. It's being sold and got reimbursement in countries, particularly the Nordics, part of Northern Europe and UK, and soon we hope in other countries like the US, but that's now taking up a greater role. Fortunately, it's obliterated administration, but it's encroaching substantially on my research and clinical activity. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I thought what I would really want to do is to talk about where the future lies for neurodegeneration. And I'm going to take a somewhat philosophical view about this, but I also have the fortune that I've been practicing longer than it will take to get to 1950. So I have actually lived through quite a lot of changes. I can say that I was practicing before there were CT scans, MRI scanners, and so I understand how things can change dramatically. So one of the problems for degenerative disease is not just neurodegeneration, is that our idea of disease is that there's a single agent, and that if you can find that cause and obliterate that cause, the disease will go away. So in the case of smallpox, you vaccinate, it's gone, and there is no more disease. But degenerative diseases are different, and I'm going to use cardiovascular disease as an example to show you how it changes, and then a little parable. So my parable is what causes World War I, and I'm going to use the model of World War I and ask the question about how we would approach that. And we might think of the end of the war, and since it's nearly 100 years since the World War I, that's why I'm using it, but the end of the war is like end stage or organ failure. Once it's there, it's very hard to do the repair or do preventative stuff. You've got to rebuild or start again. So if we were a biologist and asked to think about how you would treat a war, then we would do graphs and show that dead soldiers were a proportion of bullets or tanks, and so we might try and produce a monoclonal antibody knock out the bullets and the tanks. And what we would find is that, sure, that we dramatically drop the number of bullets, but soldiers would find another way of killing each other, and so the war would go on. And that's so often the case with neurodegeneration. We think we find proximate causes, but they are actually a long way downstream. And then we would look back and say, well, how did it really begin? We would go right back to the cause of the process, and we'd find that Garrett Vincent shot the Archduke, and that was really how it began. So we would produce a Prince knockout mouse, and this would show that we actually really delayed the process by 6 months because something else would tip the war into process. And so we go back a little further and we find that actually what happened was there's social unrest with fading empires, growing Germany, revolutions, interest in democracy, i.e. there were risk factors. And that any one of these risk factors would have been enough to start the war. But when you get the confluence of 2 or 3, then many things can precipitate the war. But once the war begins, it has a process of its own, which is different from the risk factors. Now, I think we can then draw an analogy that risk factors, disease onset, active disease, and failed organs are very much like what happens in wars, and that discovery of the degeneration really takes the course that I did, just took with you, that we have to work backwards further and further to find the risk factors. And so we're going to use heart disease as an example. We would say go back to the 1800s, and we didn't have heart disease, we had dropsy or generalized edema. And it was then discovered, well, actually that's really 2 conditions, it's heart disease and kidney disease. And then after that, it was recognised that really what the problem was were heart attacks or valve disease, which was actually what's caused the heart disease. And people were slowly tracking back to find the process to atheroma and envelopes, and then finally to the risk factors of hypertension, diabetes, smoking, and lipid disorders. So when you go further back, this idea of the cause just slips between the fingers, and you can't really find the focal factor. So if we, I'll go through here, to think about where we are in this process from 1976 to 2016, which is when I started medicine, I started practicing medicine, is the first cardiac units had just begun in Melbourne. So the idea of going to coronary care was brand new, and that was up to then people got managed at home rather than actually in hospital. And then we just heard Bruce talking about what we do with stroke, and that's because we modelled what happened with heart disease, which happened 20 years ago. And so these processes of going forward is that it shows that our best chance of disease modification if we can get right back to the beginning. So where will we be with neurodegeneration in 2015 is that I think we will probably know where most of the risk factors are. I'm just guessing what they will be. There will be a combination of these factors: genetic, lifestyle, toxins, age, and the gut are probably going to be factors that are going to drive neurodegeneration. But they're just guesses, but they will be the factors that we will know. And I suspect that by the time we get there, we will be looking at neurodegeneration much the same as we look at heart disease now, and bearing in mind that now we haven't got intensive care units, we haven't got risk modification, we've got a much more primitive way of looking at it. So many of those risk factors will be identifiable and treatable, and I can talk to you a little bit about how we're doing studies to actually try and do this process as we speak. And the factors that cause frailty will be similar to those that cause neurodegeneration. So we will be just bearing in mind that if we remove or slow down neurodegeneration, many of the things that put people in nursing homes will now be 15 years or 20 years delayed. And so we will be looking at people who are living well into their hundreds or more so, and that what will be damaging life will no longer be neurodegeneration, but will be orthopedic or rheumatological or other factors. However, we will still have suffering, and happiness will remain the same, and we'll still have competitions. And so I don't think that all that much will be solved. I'm very happy to talk, as I said, to you about the PKG if you wish, but you might prefer to actually ask questions at this stage.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. We can open the floor up to just a few questions. Yeah.
I have a question. Could you please just unpack the risk factor of the gut in terms of its effect on neurodegeneration?
So I was particularly thinking about Parkinson's here. So there's what's called the Braak hypothesis for Parkinson's disease, and this was a pathologist from Austria in 2002 who showed that when we look at people who die from accident or for other causes, he did a systematic review looking in every part of the body for Lewy bodies, and he found that you could find Lewy bodies in the gut before you found Lewy bodies in neurons of the gut, and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus or in the olfactory bulb. He then showed that the next place that you see it is the gut plus locus coeruleus, then the gut plus locus coeruleus in the substantia nigra, and then finally the cortex. And so he has this hypothesis that it spreads from portals of entry in the gut or the olfactory bulb up the neuraxis and from that position. So we're increasingly finding that many of the Alzheimer's, again, there's this question about whether in fact it's centrally originating in the brain or actually traversing the process traversing across the blood-brain barrier. And so I think that we still have to ask the question as to how much of the changes that occur might actually enter or begin, not primarily as a CNS origin.
If the major neurodegenerative diseases were to be, for example, cured in the future, how much would that affect the average lifespan?
Okay. So let me just pick on semantics first. The thing about risk factors means that we can't cure a degeneration. We can actually treat the risk factors. So if you think about what's happened with heart disease, we haven't cured heart disease. We've actually addressed the risk factors where we can. Now, lifestyle being what it is, we always find a new way to actually reduce those risk factors. So the IT revolution has produced a generation of people who don't move as much, and so cardiac disease is back again, even though we thought we were addressing the risk factors. So I don't think we will cure neurodegeneration, but we'll have a much greater chance of addressing it at a time when we can significantly modify it and delay it. So just want to make that point. So I think that if you go through and say take over the last 50 years and look at what were the primary causes of death, when I was a medical student, unequivocally the most common cause of stroke was hypertensive hemorrhage. And the most common cause of death was vascular disease, and cancer was a much later, a long way down the list. Now, orders have been reversed, and cancer looks like it's still got a fair chance of being knocked off its perch. And again, when I was a medical student, lymphoma was a fatal disease, leukemia was a fatal disease, and so these are changing their orders. So that's all been good news, but that meant that we now die of neurodegenerative diseases instead. You delay that, life increases, but there will be something else there instead, and I suspect it will be orthopedic and rheumatological factors, but I think we will. So again, talking about what happens, when I was a medical student, you would not operate on someone who was 70 because their life expectancy was so short and their risk factors were so high. You wouldn't operate on them, say, for a neck of femur. Now, the effect of that has been we've just produced another 20 years of good life. And I think if we knock off neurodegeneration or delay it, we'll produce another 20 years on top of that. So most people will be living, I think, beyond 100.
Have you tried commercializing some of your research before, and what made you try to commercialize it this time?
No, I hadn't tried before, but I think it was because, so let me make it clear, I don't think this is my best research. So there's a difference between things of commercial value and things that you think are really good things, your best insights into the scientific process. The reason we tried to commercialise this is because it was a topic or an outcome which in itself was going to make a difference to the way medicine was practiced. And that means that therefore it was going to be something that governments would reimburse, and that meant that to actually get it in the hands of clinicians, one had to make it a commercially valuable thing. Unfortunately, that you can't just philanthropically give it to someone because there's got no way of distributing and making it work because we've commercialised medicine.
And how do you find it as your first commercialization?
Giving do I like being a businessman? No, I don't like but I think the thing is one of the reasons we do research is to make a difference and make something that is actually going to make an outcome in clinical practice. And one of the and I say this quite honestly, I think it's an unfortunate side effect to actually turn something into something that is clinically useful and used in medicine means that it actually has to have a commercial value to get there. There's very few things that can't do that, and so yes, it's been very educational. Would I like to do it? There's a little, not much.
Thank you. I think we might leave it there. I'd like to present Vince. Thank you once again for coming along. Hands up.